Okay, I'm going to
Make sure
start the
everyone
recording.
else is muted.
Yes, everyone's muted except the speakers and me. I would like to welcome everyone to our very first Astrological Magic question and answer panel. My name is Elizabeth Hazel. I'm the current president of SMARRT, which is a chapter of NCGR in the Ann Arbor area, southeast Michigan and Ohio. And we're very excited to be able to present this fantastic lineup of panelists today. Very exciting. So before I introduce our panelists, people inquired about making a donation for the event, and you can send one through PayPal to smartmitch2010@gmail.com, and that would be much appreciated. And I'd also like to announce that SMARRT will be hosting the Traditional Astrology Summit, which is a 2-day webinar conference in April 2021. We've got an amazing lineup of speakers, and they'll be giving lectures on various methods and techniques from Hellenic, Persian, and medieval methodologies. So if you're interested in receiving information about that event, please contact smartmitch2010@gmail.com, and we'll put you on our list because we'll probably start doing registrations after the presidential election, probably in December, and we'll get the promotion going up, but there will be an early bird special for that. Also, for a note for attendees, I'm going to keep my eye on the chat box, and if any of you lucky contestants ask a question that is on point, I will pass it along to the panelists. So now allow me to introduce our panelists for today. First of all, Christopher Warnock, who is the elder statesman of the Astrological Magic Revival. He's a traditional astrologer who specializes in magic and talismans, pentacles and amulets, and does electional and horary astrology as well, and works in a real wide range of magical and spiritual traditions. He offers resources, classes, and books on his Renaissance astrology site, which is really fabulous. His translation of Picatrix with John Michael Greer and other vital manuscripts on this subject are available through his site. We are honored to have Michael Ofek today. He's an astrologer, writer, and teacher from Israel. His focus is on exploring Hellenistic astrology's connections with Greco-Egyptian cosmology, philosophy, and magic. Michael gives worldwide lectures and magical retreats. He's the co-founder of the Urania Astrology magazine. Clifford Low is best known for his studies of Picatrix, the medieval manuscript of magic, especially on the materiality of astrological talismans and on planetary spirit evocation. Clifford has extensive experience in numerous systems of magic and divination and owns one of the largest private libraries of the arcane. You can connect with Clifford at cliffordlow.com and reach at sorcery@gmail.com. Sorry about that. Okay, and our final panelist is Josh Proto, who has created over 100 astrological talismans, according to traditional sources like Picatrix, 3 books of occult philosophy, and the oral teachings of select Tibetan Buddhist Tantra since 2014. Josh helps clients find talismanic and ritual solutions to a variety of astrological and magical problems. And you can contact him through his website at stellartalismans.com. So let's open up the questions. Josh, you're going to be my first crash test dummy here, hon.
Oh, lovely.
Okay, what kind of objects and tools do you have ready to go or pre-made components on hand when you get started, when you're going to do a talisman creation?
For sure. So this definitely, I'd say personally, is election dependent. If this is something that, I've determined is incredibly rare and very, very fortunate, then I will set aside a number of pre-made components. I really love planetary rings and pendants. So sometimes I will set the stones in their settings, whether it be a pendant or ring setting beforehand, and then make sure I do the engraving. But that's mostly the talismanic materials. But I have my incense of choice all ready to go. I have my engraver. I have my jeweler's epoxy and glue that I will use to set to it. But generally, it's a very Spartan mix. If I have my incense materials, my engraving materials, and then the talismanic materials, generally stones and silver settings. Those are sort of my go-to sort of things. Anything outside of that, I like to, really prepare a process for, making sure I have my images selected. So I have a number of sketches sort of sitting right by me. So just in case I have the little ghost in my brain flies out of my head at 4 a.m., 3 a.m. when I'm making some of these talismans, I can just sort of look at the image and be like, okay, that's what I'm going to do. So I can just make as many as possible. Because sometimes with these elections, it's going to be another 24 years till I even get a shot at making these talismans again. So just want to make sure that I have the minimum viable necessary products.
Okay, well, let me bounce the question to Clifford. What do you do in advance? What's your pre-mades?
Oh, pre-made. Well, I used to actually buy rings straight off of eBay, and I used that for a while, but I developed a relationship with a jeweler who will select gemstone cabochons that I can choose from photographs she sends me, and then she wire wraps the rings in gold, silver, or gold-filled wire. And she sends them to me, and I basically line them up in a row, and I prepare by having my charcoal burner, incense compounded. I often moisten herbs overnight so that it glues better underneath the rings. I don't use jeweler's glue. I use Gorilla Glue, which I think sticks a little bit longer. I did use jeweler's glue for a while, but the herbs just kept falling out. Gorilla Glue is really messy, and I can give you a long list of very boring techniques that I use to make Gorilla Glue more manageable, but it's not really relevant to the majority of people. One of the things that I borrowed from Picatrix is there's an instruction to use something which is a lot like a metal funnel to direct the jet of smoke directly upwards, so it points towards the midheaven roughly. And this is to widen the energy flow between the celestial powers and the terrestrial sphere. And I use that over my my incense burner, my brazier. What else do I have? I use wooden matches. For me, wooden matches are almost like little sacrifices to light the charcoal and the candles and so forth. I only use the candles for lighting. Those are not usually offerings, though I know other people do use candle offerings. Let's see, what else? And of course, diamond tip styluses. I always have 2 bottles of Gorilla Glue and 2 diamond tip styluses, because if it turns out that the Gorilla Glue has dried out overnight without me realizing it, I have a backup, because time is short during an electional window. I can use the backup, and as for the engraver will essentially break over time, and you never know when that will be. So having at least 2 lined up is always a good idea. And of course, I use water to basically activate the Gorilla Glue. So I usually have 2 solo cups in front of me to dip the rings in to activate them. I also use something which is a variation on Picatrix. Picatrix advises that you take your talismans and you put them in a kind of a basket over a cruciform piece of metal corresponding to the planets over the incense smoke. But you have to make that during an election, and I don't have anybody who can make that for me. So what I do is just disposable chopsticks I get from the Chinese restaurant, and I put the talismanic ring, and I mostly work with talismanic rings, through the 2 chopsticks, and then bend them apart so that they form a cross, and I put them over the jet of smoke coming out of the steel funnel. So that's what I usually have in front of me when I'm beginning this.
Let me bounce it to Michael. What do you start with? What do you pre-prepare or have ready on hand when you're ready to go, before you're ready to go?
Well, I can split this to things that are, on the altar, and things that I'm preparing from advance to make the talisman. And well, on the altar, I'll just read you that it will be just faster. I just did a small list of that. Well, 1 or 2 candles, the incense burner. I have this kind of lighter, which seems very useful. You know this, yeah? For the charcoals. I have a handmade cloth with different colors, the Shipibo style, these kinds. I have many of these. I have a Kero cup, which is a ceremonial Peruvian cup, which I put laurel water inside if I use it, or other things. An engraver tool. I have one with batteries, one electrical, and I also have this kind of stylus, which you can order on AliExpress for, I don't know, like $10 or something. That's not diamond tip. That's like carbon tip, something cheaper, but works. I have a smudge fan from Feathers. I'm pretty connected to this one. I did this in the Amazon with the Schwa people. So it's very basic, but I use it to move the smoke. I also have some pieces of music instruments. I have bells, you know, like these kinds. It's powerful. A rattle, a jaw harp. Sometimes I use a drum, but it depends on the ritual. I have a charging quartz crystal bowl, which I don't have with me now. And the things that I do for advance, of course, the electional times, all the written text, mostly because I write them myself, and the things that I don't write myself. And the talisman material, I use something that I hope to talk about a little bit today. I use a canister, a pre-made canister made from my jewelry, David Weitzman of Kagol that I'm working with. It looks like this. It's a small canister, you can close it. I put all the ingredients inside when I do the talisman. I have all the ingredients here. I don't think I need to show you everything, but the herbs, the stones, metals, a little scroll, which I draw things in and put inside, which is a kind of a canvas scroll. And I have agua florida, if you know what it is. It's like for purifying, and a spray, which I put inside spring water with some essential oils, or laurel water that I do from Advance. This is, I think, everything. And of course, all the incenses and stuff.
So you're doing some cleansing before you get started?
Yes.
You're cleansing your area. Okay. What about you, Christopher? What do you have on hand before you get started with a ritual?
You know, it's funny because, you know, when I first started off, we didn't have, for example, we had Agrippa, but we didn't have Picatrix. So we didn't really have much ritual instruction. What we had was electional stuff. So I actually sort of started out doing hoodoo and root work. And but when we got Picatrix, I'm like, oh, okay, finally, we've got some guidance as far as doing it. But it's funny because people ask me about ritual. I'm like, well, whatever you want to do, you know, because I have a very focused view of the elections. You know, I'm like, I want the election to be a particular way, you know, but the ritual seems to me to be much more free form. And so there's a basic structure of, in the traditional sources, of talking about, you know, you make the talisman at the elected time. We'll talk a little, and that fits with the pre-made stuff. And then you suffumigate, which is you move the talisman back and forth through the smoke of the incense. So I guess you need incense for that. And then also you call upon the spirit. So that's kind of your framework. And the universal framework, I mean, even in the Zen tradition that I work in, is you have an opening, you create the ritual space, the sacred space, you do your thing, and then you close. And so again, that's pretty universal as well. So within that whole structure, there's an almost infinite amount of different ways that people can do it. And it's cool here to see everybody's different kind of methodology. I noticed that they're sort of following my lead though, in terms of being kind of minimalist. And, you know, if you look at say Golden Dawn or Thelema or some of the other stuff, or the Solomonic tradition, there's a much more involved ritual. And there's much more of the costumes and all this other stuff that you'd get widely into. Whereas the astrological magic, at least from our traditional sources, does seem to have that minimalist ritual. And so that's sort of the framework that I started it off with. And it's interesting to see that people are kind of doing that, but everyone has their own way of doing it. So essentially with mine, you know, I do want to have at least one candle. I do light the candle. I have incense. And then whatever I'm, you know, making the talisman out of, you know, whether it's, I used to do acid etched mirrors because that's a very fast process. I do paper like a unmyodo, like a Japanese style talismans, or like the Taoist talismans. And, you know, I have the materials ready to make that. And for me, it's, you know, I make it at that time, but it's very, very bare bones, you know, the stuff that I'm doing. So I think that that's because it's the least, to me, the least of the focus. You need to do the invocation and everything, but the real focus on the sources is on the election. So, like I said, a candle, an incense, some incense, and then the materials for the talisman, and I'm pretty much set for what I'm doing.
So Ty has asked, do you need to be protected when doing an astrological talisman like the practice of Solomonic magic? And our next question was, do you make any personal preparations before creating a talisman, like special bath, clothing, personal adornment that you feel enhances your talisman making procedure? Josh, do you want to address this?
Yes, definitely. It's definitely a belief of mine, and something that I found in practice is, if you're able, in the times that I've been able to find very powerful elections, and in the process of being able to invoke those spirits, things definitely change. The atmosphere 100% shifts, and whatever shows up really shows up because you have that strong time connection, because you're understanding just the links of all of the occult virtue of the current time that's happening. So some people say, oh, Josh, do you form a circle and do like a circle protection ritual? I don't really do that. I think I lean more into, in one of the places of the Picatrix, I believe they talk about the magician or practitioner should be aligning themselves with the images. So it's like, if you're making the image of a lion, you should be, if you have killed a lion before, or have actually seen a lion, you're going to have a better time using that image. And so I think I really lean heavily into that, especially with all of the guru yoga that I do in my Buddhist practice, where I'm spending, over 100 hours trying to understand my consciousness is inseparable from like a deity. So using that practice, I can sort of lean into the goals of the talismanic election. And it's like, as soon as I find that election, I'm beginning that process and trying to 100% just act and live like that. And that can take the role. Maybe I'm like eating more foods that are associated with a certain planet. Maybe I'm being more conscious of, if I'm making Saturn talisman, I'm feeding the crows. I'm, doing that sort of stuff. But I'd say ritually, there's very few things I would do in talismanic ritual. There's other sort of astrological ritual I would do. It's different if I'm conjuring spirits or doing something a bit more Buddhist focused. Then there are more things, but it's not necessarily for protection. It's just sort of baked into the process.
Okay, let me bounce the question to Michael. Michael, do you have preparatory bathing rituals, clothing, other? I think you've indicated some of that in your first question.
Yes. Well, I can split this question into internal preparations and external physical preparations. I put a lot of emphasis on the mental, emotional preparation. Also in the ritual itself, there are things that you can do before. Let's say just an hour before, which you can bathe, of course, and clean and all this stuff. You can also traditionally, sometimes people would fast for 10 days, 7 days, 3 days. You can even just eat a little bit, or from the diet of the foods of that planet, or drink an infusion of the tea of that planet. But these are all fine, and I do some of them sometimes, depending on the importance of the ritual and the time and my ability. I also think being in solitude for at least 1 day before is good, if you only contemplate what you're going to do. But there's something that I've developed, which, if we go into the ritual, I hope to at least show in a few points, that has to do with how you charge yourself before the ritual. And this is a kind of a synthesis of some shamanic practices and how I understand the ancient cosmology behind magic and behind astrology. So I can't explain all that now because, you know, we don't have much time, but there's a procedure that I call the stripping of the image, which is really on building and congealing a kind of noetic or mental image. And I start with a certain memory that has a connection, emotional connection, you know, to that, to the image of the things that are invoked. And then I go all the levels, which corresponds to the hypostasis of the Neoplatonic levels of the cosmos. So you go from the noetic to the psychic to the physical, and you charge everything, and then you take away the image, you stay with the state, you charge yourself with that state, and then you can project that to the future and animate an internal image. And I think this process, for me, is much more important than the other processes. Like Chris said, I think the procedure itself should be minimalistic, but the components which are important are the electional time and the psychological charge and intention and single-mindedness of the magician, and everything else could, you know, is optional, I think, in some way. So I do think that we are the bridges that move the energy through us to the talisman. So in a sense, we are a kind of a microcosmos of the demiurge. You know, we are bringing the breath of life into the talisman. So I do think that preparing, focusing your attention, focusing the mental image, charging that emotional state, and through that emotional state, you can touch the universal essence of that state. And from there, when you're aligned with this and you go into the ritual, then it's really powerful. And for me, that's what makes the magic, you know, intense. So I can go on and on that, but I want to leave more time for others. I'm sorry.
Okay, so this leads us to kind of the big question that's very much central to our panel discussion today. What are your steps for talisman creation? And we're going to let all four panelists talk about this. First of all, we've talked already a bit about what you prepare and what you do before your electional window opens. Because, you know, obviously the election you choose is critical, and we'll discuss a bit of that later. But I want to go from all panelists saying, okay, as you're preparing, you're getting ready for that electional window. You get this and this done, and then this is what you do at the electional window, because I think that is of great interest to everyone. So let me bounce this to Christopher. Christopher, what do you absolutely have to do during that electional window, or before and during? And we can talk a little bit about after later, but let's just talk about immediately before and during that electional window, because it may not be much time.
Okay, now we got to back up though.
Okay.
Because that's way too detailed. The first thing I want to say is that there are an infinite ways of approaching astrological magic and doing this ritual. So if anybody comes away from this thinking that there's a right way to do this, then that's for everybody. That's just, I think that's inaccurate. I think you can find a way that works for you, that resonates for you, but it's not going to be the universal way. So what's true for me is not necessarily going to be true for everybody else, and vice versa. So we need to, I think, start from that perspective of the diversity and the excitement about being able to work with astrological magic that's so open like that. The next thing I think we need to think about is, what are we actually doing when we're making a talisman? And I think that's a later question. So that's obviously going to have a big impact on what we do in the talisman rituals. Well, what are our preconceptions about it? So think about what your preconceptions are. Know those preconceptions, understand that, because otherwise you're going to automatically think, oh, this is true, and then not recognize that's just your preconceptions talking about it. So as you're saying, you know, the election's very important. And so what do we do during the election? Well, you know, the tradition, I've decided to go with traditional sources. You know, that's just the choice that I made when I first started off. I said, I don't come from a Golden Dawn background or a modern magic or Solomonic or whatever. I really didn't have a magical background. So I was looking for, what do I base this on? So I look at the traditional sources. And what they're saying is, if you look at them, is, you know, for example, Agrippa says you inscribe the characters, or you inscribe it at that particular time. You know, so really, as you look at the Picatrix of various other things, the view I've taken is that you want it to take on that form. Now, that's not the only way to do it, but that's just how I've decided to go ahead and do it. So what I typically want to do is to have a technique for talisman making that allows me to have something take on that final form. So for example, it could be as high tech as printing it out on your color printer. That's happening during that time. Or it could be using a diamond tip stylus. It could be doing calligraphy. It could be casting. I mean, the talismans that I'm selling on my website have always been done for me by jewelers, because it's such a specialized skill. And what they're doing is, I'm giving them a window, and they need to pour that metal during that into the mold at that particular time, so that the crystallization, the form is taking at that point. Now, I don't think that's the only way to fly. You know, I think what you could do is have a certain amount of pre-made stuff, and you could do some assembly. And I think that the ring stuff, I mean, that was sort of typical for that. It's not exactly how I do it, but I certainly wouldn't look at that and say, oh, even for me, that's outside the pale. Now, things that I would say I'm getting a little leery personally about are just consecrating. If something's made at a different time and you're just consecrating it at that time, or you have a process that, like engraving, that takes several hours, and so you're going to go outside your window. Those, for me personally, I would say, you know what, that's not in accordance with what I do. But again, not to say that that's wrong or that's impossible to do it that way. But I get the sense that from talking to, you know, other people that are doing traditional style, is that there is sort of a tendency to go with the inscription, but there's also some pre-made stuff too. So again, I think it's very important to recognize that there's a lot of diversity, and really what you're going to have to find is what resonates for you, right? As opposed to, this is the answer and this is how it has to be done. And if somebody doesn't do it like me.
Yep. Did his connection break?
Oh,
Looks like his connection got stuck. Why don't we bounce it to Joshua? What are you doing during the window? During that window, right? Leading up to it and during your election of a window.
Sure, definitely. I think, you know, I think I definitely agree a lot with what Chris had said. And, you know, to preface it, I'll say, you know, I had a, you know, because I'm trained as like a biochemist. And so I had a teacher who discovered how geckos cling to walls. And he was like, okay, I'm going to teach you how to do science. And he's like, I don't need an accurate description of reality. I just need one that works. So I'm going to share with you what I have found that, you know, sort of works, in hopes that you can sort of pull some things that are available to get you some results. Because I know we have some questions about, like, you know, how do we get results? So I'm going to try to answer in that way. And that is, you know, in the sense of, I want to end up in the final form with the most power. Like, the final form of my talisman needs to happen at sort of like the peak of the election. So, you know, for me, I am wanting that main significator, you know, probably within like 5, if not 3 degrees of sort of like the ascendant or midheaven. And so as soon as what I determine is like the minimum of viable orb and application of whatever my peak election is, that is when I am beginning to actually put the incense onto the coals. So I'll light the coals sort of like outside, but as soon as the subfumigation hits, for me, that's like, okay, we're firing up the engines and we're ready for liftoff. Like, we're trying to break the atmosphere at this point. So that's what's happening. And then I will sort of prep my stones and prep my bases, sort of review the images leading up to this peak point. And I would say that for me, the most powerful talismans I've been able to make, or the ones that are getting as most communication with me, I am finishing the engraving and fusing the bases together and saying the petition and waving it through the smoke, sort of at like this peak moment. So in sort of whatever is like the 2 or 3 most like closest degrees to the actual point. So, you know, I sort of see it as like a crescendo. You know, there's like a peak moment and there's like a descending action if you have like 10 minutes. So, you know, can't do averages in my head right now, but whatever is sort of like the middle minute, that's sort of like, okay, that's the peak point of the election. So I want to sort of be doing the petitions with everything set in their final forms at this time. And then there's sort of like a descending crescendo. And generally, I'd say, during that last part of the election, I'm not really doing much. I'm sort of like feeling the ambient vibrations of like, okay, how did things went? Usually, and start looking for like, sort of signs, environmental signs, somatic signs within my body. I'll do sometimes this meditation and tuning in with the talismans and the energy. And then I like to, like from Libra Luna, I think it says, lick your talismans to establish a bond with them, activate the spirit. And like for my personal ones,
lick them? Really?
I do. I'll lick it on video. I will lick the inscription. So it knows like this is like, I have birthed you into existence and I am taking responsibility for you. And so it's like I would also like to do that within the election and introduce myself to them. So that's the most important qualities that I look to do during the election.
Okay. Well, let me bounce it to Clifford. Talk about your beginning and central moment at that election.
Sure. Most of my answers are already, but I left our call about 15 minutes before I began the process. If it's a planetary hour boundary or 8 degrees of application towards the ascendant or midheaven for the planet or star, that's when I'll begin to start scoop the incense onto the coal and put the steel funnel up. But I only begin engraving around 5 degrees of application, and I have a hard cutoff for that at 8 degrees of separation for planets. For fixed stars, it's much more narrow than that. It's about 8 degrees or 3 degrees orb around the angle, which means about 1.5 degrees moiety. So that basically means that it's kind of hard to create a whole lot of fixed star talismans at once. I use the same orb, however, for lunar mansions and decans as the planets. What I do is once I begin the engraving, I put the talisman over the smoke and declare my intentions. And this is a modified version of the petitions from Picatrix, which I broke down into 4 different sections. The first, the naming of the planet or star, like calling upon Saturn. Then you describe its attributes. Saturn, you are cold and dark. The third segment is praising it. You are the highest and the most powerful of all the planets. And the last, which is the discharge, where you tell it what you want to do. I want your spirits and power to go into this talisman to extend my longevity or whatever else its purpose is. Then I bask in smoke multiple times, the incense smoke. I add the herbs, state the petition again, bask in smoke again, and finally, to the end of the ritual, I bask in smoke and state my petition one more time. I allow a little bit of cheating where even if the planet has moved past 8 degrees of separation with a planetary hour, I can continue to mold the Gorilla Glue because it takes about an hour for Gorilla Glue to mold. And my rule for that is to maximize the importance of the electional window so that I never add anything to the talismanic herbs after the window is closed, but I can trim and so forth and beautify the talisman a little bit through that procedure. So that's basically what I do. And as for closure, I'm extremely minimalistic. I just make sure the talismans are hard, dry, and ready. And I take a shower because I'm pretty sweaty after all that's done.
Okay. So what about you, Michael? Talk about your ritual procedure.
Yes. Well, I think that's maybe true for all of us. I don't know if that's true for all of us, but the scale of the procedure can be more elaborate and more minimalistic depending on time, importance, different other things. So I will try to describe some kind of an average. You can do that. Many things are optional, but I kind of break it down to 4 stages. One is the pre-preparation, which I talked about before, and this model I developed of kind of image energetic kind of work. When you go into the ritual itself, then you do the purification, then you do an alignment and focus I call it, which is a kind of a general alignment, specific alignment with the, in a sense, with the telos, with that image of the thing that you want to achieve. And then the last stage is what I call the release and charge. And I add some components here, which again emphasize the intention and what you can call, for a lack of another term, a kind of an energetic work. We talked about the pre-preparation a little bit. So the first steps in creating the right setting and purification. So then you arrange all the elements and tools. You can set the atmosphere, certain lights. You have really nice LED lights that you can change the lighting so you can, do the atmospheres as you like. Then I do what I call, in that purification, it's kind of analogous to the washing of the mouth, which is a Babylonian and also kind of an Egyptian term for purifying the statue before you install it. So that's the first thing, you purify, you clean the space, and miasma, which is kind of the bad vapors of the bad spirits, which the Peruvian shamans call the hucha. You can do that by using fire and water. You can smudge, that's the limpia, with sulfur, with copal, with sage. You can spray water, spring water or seawater. You can add essential oils and do that pre-made. You can do agua florida, of course. You can even do lustral water if you know how to make that. It's really simple. Kernip, when you squinch some herb into seawater or spring water in a cup, and then you can take that and spray it and put it on your hands and your face. So this is the cleaning from before. And of course, clean your mind, purify your mind, relax and be fully present. All these things are very important for me, even if I don't use all the, all the stuff, and I go very, very basic. Then the purifying of the mind, relaxation, single-mindedness, going with a conviction, that's really important. And then you can light the candle, an instance with intention, of course. And during the electional window itself, I'm doing the alignment and focusing that I told you about. And that could be elaborate and could be very, very simple. Some can call the 4 quarters. The PGM is a nice ritual for calling the 4 quarters. You can call your guardian spirit or a helper or someone. You can make a general invocation. What I do is a kind of standing posture, which I align myself to the poles and the turning of the earth. I can also align myself to that planet or the fixed star. And I do a certain energy tuning, which I wouldn't explain now because it's a little complicated. Rooting myself in the earth and the sky and becoming that bridge. And then I do the focusing thing. I will try to make it a little shorter. That's, I think, the most elaborate answer I will give in the whole panel. So in the focusing, I retrieve the image that I worked on before, because I have a certain address or some key that I can retrieve it fast, and align what I call the 3 suns, the noetic, psychic, and physical. So now I'm invoking the full image in my presence. I can hymn, the planetary vowel or chord, or just sing intuitively. But I want to be engaged. I want to be in ecstasy, really. I want to be ecstatic from what I'm doing. So I have a lot of additions to that, but I couldn't go into that today. And then I do the vocal invocation to the planet, something I've written before. And just to add something, in the pre-preparation, when I did the image work, then I do a sigil or write something after I really know what I want to achieve. I really want to know what I'm asking for. Then I write down something from advance, or do an image from advance, or take an image from traditional sources And then I sit down and engrave, and this is I do when I'm feeling that charge in me. So I'm sitting down, I carve, I write on the paper, I put all the things in the canister if I do the canister thing, and then it's a little bit more elaborate because I take each and every one of them, I put my breath 3 times in it, I put it inside, I put wax on it, I close it, and when I close it, then that's the election time, the specific election time. It's when it's the talisman is finished. So in a sense, it's the carving and thing is not really far from that specific climax time. We're talking about minutes before or whatever, depending on how elaborate it is. And when I finish closing it, then I do what I call the release and charge, which also pretty elaborate to describe, but I'll just say, a couple of words. That's the opening of the mouth. This is the I call it, the Iamblikos call it the photogogia, the channeling of the light, the charging with the secret fire. So this is a real kind of energetic work. I become a chora, a receptacle. I move that charge through me, and I move it through the talisman, through my hands. Okay? That's very physical. That's very concrete, because I think the energy is pretty concrete, living energy. It has subtleties, of course, and maybe it's not the only thing, but it's also very potent. And that's what I do at the minute that I cross that, when the significator hits the ascendant or the MC. So I start charging the talisman with the energies that flow through me. And this could be very, very intense. And this is something that I practiced for a long time. So it's not something that I would say that it's easy to achieve in the first time, but it needs practice. And that's it. When I feel it's done, then I suffumigate the talisman, merging it with the elemental fire, connecting it. And in completion, I really, I just put the talisman on the altar until the candle dies. I can put it in an incubation kind of egg that I have with all its ingredients, herbs and stuff around it, or anoint it with oil. It depends again on how elaborate I go. And then I can, relax, give thanks. Sometimes I can, pour libation or make it a despacho. A despacho is Spanish for an offering. So you can offer some, wine or stuff for the spirit. These are options, but the charging part and the modifying of the talisman itself, or completing it, putting all the elements from the natural kingdoms together, and the scroll with your little drawing or description or intention together. This what makes it, have its full body, and then you charge it with life. So this is the fastest I could go for my ritual, at least the average one.
Audio, because I have low bandwidth. It's a very low bandwidth connection.
Oh, I think we've got Christopher back here. Sorry, he's getting his video getting started again.
Yeah, this is a very low bandwidth backup connection, so I'm not gonna be able to do video.
Okay. Well, I have returned you as a co-host so you can speak. So we've kind of gotten an idea of how all 4 of these magicians proceed through their processes. So let's ask and shift the questioning a little bit to their spirituality and how much your ritual talisman making is tied to your spirituality, deity, or pantheon you're connected with, or is your talisman making separate and different and outside of your regular spiritual practices? And I know Josh was interested in this question.
Yes, and I would start off and say that, is in terms of my talismanic practices and a ritual, I'd say it probably draws more from like a Hellenistic, Roman, and Iranian background, mostly just because of the sources that I'm that I'm using. I sort of am just mainly gathering from those sources, though it's hard for me to fully divorce it from all of the teachings and sort of the practices I've learned through my Tibetan and Newar Buddhism and practices, and learning parts of the Jyotish and Tibetan astrology that I do. So a lot of the times, I would say, sometimes the petitions I am using, or the way I'm approaching the spirit and the hierarchy, does draw from some of these sources. I will, speak to the qualities that I've been taught, or that I've read in different traditions, that as they relate to the planets, and work that into my petition in sort of a similar way that Cliff was talking about, of sort of like invoking them, buttering them up, talking about their qualities, and then asking for what you want, or sort of getting to that crescendo. I will use those qualities in it. I think the largest way that my approach of talismans is influenced by my spiritual practice as a Buddhist, because I do consider myself a Buddhist. I'm a Vajrayana practitioner. One day we'll become a Vajracharya priest, and I'm training to do that, which is a Newar Buddhist practice. I think the scope and the dedications and motivations for like why I do this is very much rooted in that. And I relate it into, in some of the medieval and Renaissance sources, talking about like by making talismans, you're awakening these stones or this metal to their occult nature as part of this hierarchy. And it's that moment of awakening that I take very, very seriously. And I'm giving the whole planetary hierarchy and the planetary intelligences themselves, and the planet's the root of that source, the opportunity to receive, I would say, the benefits of life. In Buddhism, they talk about like the Navagrahas, or the planets. They live in a realm of the gods. And the thing about the gods is that they do not have the foresight or the humility to understand their own plight. A god only knows that they will die like 10,000 years before it happens. And it's that moment of realization of their own mortality that they just slam back down either into the human or hell realms. And so I am hoping that by making these talismans and gaining communication with these planetary hierarchies, I can liberate the spirits of their own demise, if not the planets themselves. I think I am moved. How long? It's very easy to think like, oh no, Mars has been retrograde and Saturn just went direct, and just hammering all of us. Like these transits are just hammering us in the face. How do you think the planets themselves are actually experiencing this? Very, very tragic, very, very horrible. What is the most, shattering thing to understand? Like, why is Saturn so sad, and why is he so upset all the time? They are, because they know that they are destined this path for all of eternity. It takes a certain person or a certain entity not to be broken by that. And I think, one of my goals is to alleviate the suffering of the planets themselves. And I have found success in doing that with ritual procedure, especially with Jupiter. And, the practice of talismans and planetary magic is sort of like a means to this ultimate end. So although the practical elements of what I'm doing doesn't really differ from, I'd say, the people who have really helped revive this, like Chris. But I'd say the dedications and motivations are certainly my own and influenced by myself as a Buddhist.
We did have a question for Christopher.
Okay.
It's a question about when your jewelers are making things, do they do invocations or suffumigations?
Oh, big time.
Okay.
I mean, that's the hardest thing about finding a jeweler, is that you got to find some crazy fanatic who, first of all, is willing to get up at 2 o'clock in the morning, if that's when the electional is open, and then who loves the stuff so much that we're willing to put all this. I mean, that's the thing. I remember talking to jewelers and saying, would you do this? And they would just be like, what? I mean, first of all, they didn't want to have the schedule fixed. And second of all, the effort that it takes. So I'm lucky. The jeweler I work with name is Muhammad Ajmal, who's actually in Pakistan, and he is an expert. He's a Sufi and a real expert on Arabic letter magic and Arabic magic as well, which is exciting for me because that's one of my backgrounds is in Sufism. So one of the great things about working with him is being able to awaken that, that Sufism that I haven't been practicing, openly, because I haven't been with a sheikh or in a hanaha. But like Josh, I'm also a Buddhist. And the cool thing about astrological magic from a Buddhist perspective is that it's already sort of integrated into the whole practice. I mean, you can, for example, in the Shingon, which I've been initiated in Shingon into Tantric Buddhism in Japan. I haven't really practiced it because, again, you need a priest to do it. But in that pantheon, they have a whole section of planetary deities, and I have a mandala that's got all these deity, Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, and then up on the right-hand corner, there's a section with the planetary gods in there. So they're already pretty much integrated into that. And again, with Onmyodo from the Taoist tradition, there's a tremendous amount of sort of stellar magic that's already kind of put into that. The only difference that makes to me in terms of when I do ritual is that I do call upon the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas as part of my sort of, we call on God, or, it's just as part of the ritual. And so I do think but yeah, it's extremely important. It's usually for the stuff I do, it has to be a team effort. You need to have the astrologer, you need to have an artist to do the images, you need to have a jeweler then to do the casting, because to create metal talismans is really complex. There's so many things that go into it. And I think that's a really excellent question. But, I think that more than the ritual itself, I think that my whole orientation towards astrological magic is influenced by Buddhism. And again, this is just one way to fly. Not everybody has to do this. I mean, I consider myself more of a celestial priest, and I have a more devotional style practice. So my focus will be, for example, every day I do an invocation of the planets. And so I have a very strong relationship. And that's how I focus on, rather than the individual talismanic ritual as being a big deal. But again, I really want to point out to everybody that it's exciting to see all these different ways of doing it, but you can develop your own methodology that resonates with you. And so, I definitely wouldn't want anyone to come away from me saying, oh, you have to do it this way. But it's actually very exciting to have your own thing to do.
Very good. I like that. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about any tips you might have about working with the temperament of specific planets or stars, malefic, benefic. Do you approach them differently when you do the ritual? So if you're doing say a talisman for Saturn or Mars, is that going to be inherently difficult than working with one of the benefic planets, like, Venus, Jupiter, Moon, whatever? Clifford, do you want to start off with this?
Sure. My experience is that creating talismans is very similar between all the different hierarchies of planets, stars, and so forth. It's different.
Oops. Now Clifford drops. We have a lot of
when you're working in other types of.
Sorry, your connection is blitzing a little bit.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, that's better.
Okay, transitory. All right, I'll repeat myself in case I wasn't heard. When it comes to the crafting of talismans, for me, whether they're benefic, malefic, hot, cold, it's all the same for the most part, except for the individual correspondences that are appropriate for each. It's very, very different when you're doing different types of astrological magic rituals other than talismans. So one of the things that I do that I think is relatively unique is that I have attempted to reverse engineer Picatrix's celestial petitions, which are ritual magic, ceremonial magic for the granting of an individual wish. And this is the exact opposite of that, where you are dressing in not only planetary colors, but elaborate costumes, almost Halloween costumes for each of the 7 traditional planets and for the fixed stars and so forth. You're leaning heavily into planetary dieting and celestial dieting. The suffumigations are not one ingredient, but sometimes as many as 22 or 25 ingredients. And in addition to garb, you have to have odd accoutrements. So when I'm doing a Mars ritual, I actually have to carry a gun or a sword. And when I'm doing a Mercury ritual, I have to have a notepad or a scroll. These are extremely diverse based upon what you're communicating with, because you're trying to create yourself as an embodiment, a student, a physical representation or vessel, the astral light of that celestial hierarchy.
But this is a petition and not a talisman, correct?
Right. we are a little bit fast and loose with regards to the use of the word petition. When you're saying petition, you're just asking something from a celestial hierarchy or a spirit power. But the petitions that I'm talking about right now are a type of rituals which appear in Picatrix. Actually, there's slightly more text devoted in Picatrix to petitions than talismans. We just focus a lot more on the talismans because the talismans are relatively easy to create. The petitions are extremely hard to do because you have to compound, 11 to 25 ingredients and so forth, get the costumes right. You have to recite an invocation, which sometimes can last 20 minutes or more and repeat. You have to go in particular postures, bow in various ways before it's done. It's a much more complex thing, but I like challenges, so that's one of the things I do and get hired for mostly.
Okay, well, let's bounce this to Michael. What about you? Do you have a difference between malefic, benefic at all, between the way you treat different entities, deities?
Yes, of course. Well, they have a different internal music, a different tone. Of course, you can also tune your settings to that and other things, and of course, there are different correspondences and colors and stuff. But I think that the most crucial element is embodying their tone. So if you are an astrologer or someone that has an experience with astrology, so you also have that point of reference already. You are sampling it whenever you have a Mars transit or a Saturn transit, or this energy. And I'm always taking the emphasis to the internalized experience. So I think that if you know how to play on that chord, in a sense, and feel that heaviness or that kind of presence of Saturn within you. It doesn't have to be that melancholic Saturn. You can, try to focus on a higher expression of it. But in a sense, you need to have that tone because you are really tapping into something that is happening at that moment. And you want to increase what you're tapping into in order to be a conduit for that energy. So, that's not invalidating, people that don't do this kind of thing. But, sometimes the invocation can be enough. But for me, this is the difference between the planets. They have different music, and you have to, in a sense, tune yourself to that music in order to, to channel them, in a sense.
Okay, so about how long before the window or during the window do you offer an invocation? Is it right on the election in that window, or are you invoking up to that window? Clifford, someone is asking this, so I'm trying to see who's that. Tanya, is if you've got a lengthy invocation.
Right. When it comes to petitions, I use the start time as important at the beginning of it because it will go beyond the electional window under most circumstances. Because not only is the incantation long, but it has to be recited sometimes 3 times or more. And in this circumstance, because you're not changing the form of something, the initiation of the ritual, the commencement of the ritual is the key time for that. So sometimes I'll wait until the planet is exactly at 0 degrees of application in order to get the maximum attention, positive attention of that celestial hierarchy. And it doesn't have quite the same rules as the construction of a talisman.
Right, but I think you were discussing a few days ago that you use very minimal talisman invocations.
Right, I tend to keep it. Right, when if I feel like I have a lot of time, I will use the 4 part that I described before, the naming of the celestial hierarchy, describing one or more of its attributes, flattery, and what you want to do. But ultimately, I may just call upon the talisman and tell it what I want to do. So the most minimal would be, say, I call upon you, Saturn, in the name of God, infuse this talisman with your pneuma power and spirit, period.
So that's not even 5 seconds. So you can really fit your invocation inside of your election window. It doesn't require a big buildup beforehand. correct?
Quite.
You
And
can
I do
really
that for
fit it.
every individual talisman. So it does take a little bit more time, but I want to make sure that the intentionality and the connection between the hierarchy and the individual talisman is equal between all of them.
Okay. What about you, Chris? Are you doing that same thing? Are you using really short invocations for talismans for your jeweler?
Here's the thing. I get this intense feeling like we're looking for the right answer here. People are like, what should I do? What's the right answer? There isn't one. There's not one right answer. There's a couple of sort of right answers. There's a lot of wrong answers. Okay. So, you know, again, when I try to emphasize, it's like I started off, said, let's look what the traditional sources say. That's just, again, one possible methodology. Now, I'm not a relativist. I'm not saying you can do anything you want. So all this focus on this little detailed stuff, as I think missing the point a little bit, what you need to do is immerse yourself in this practice, immerse yourself in the sources and what all these different people are saying now. We have an incredible community that's built up. Find out what resonates for you. Because for me, I'm so much less focused on ritual because what I'm looking for is to be inspired. What I really feel is successful in a ritual is there's an uplifting feeling. You know, it doesn't always happen that you don't have to. I'm not going to look for that, say, oh, it's failed if I didn't do that. But I'm most happy with ritual where I feel like there's a connection, because that's what I'm looking for as, you know, in my practice as a celestial priest, as an astrological magician, is the connection and the continuing connection to what I consider these angelic spirits. And again, you don't have to interface at that level. You can interface with them at a more give me what I want level, or a demonic level, or a whatever level you want to. But what I would say about this is don't worry about the details. Don't get caught up with all this, and don't worry about it. If you do something wrong, it's going to blow up like a grenade. What you need to do is to, like I said, immerse yourself in this so it's deeply, deeply felt, deeply understood, this knowledge, this great wisdom, and then find the path that works for you. And like I said, there's sort of rules of thumb. I'm noticing that Michael and Cliff and Josh and everything, you know, and we have some similarities in what we're doing. That's great. There's some framework. But don't be afraid to find out what resonates for you, and don't worry. That's what I get. The most people say, should I buy this Venus talisman? I'm afraid. I'm like, afraid of a Venus talisman? Particularly like the Warnock angelic style Venus talismans. I'm like, you really don't have to worry about it, but they're scared, you know? And there's so much programming, you know, from 2,000 years of being told magic is dangerous, magic is horrible. Now it's like electricity. Again, you don't want to wire up a circuit box if you don't know what you're doing, but you don't want to just say, oh, I'm not going to use electricity because it might be dangerous. It's like, no, that's not, and that's what I'd say about this. Particularly that's why I like the devotional practice too. It's a little safer, but nevertheless, again, don't worry about the details. Find out what works for you. Find out the music. I like that. Michael was talking about the music. Tune yourself so you're playing along with that music, and then you don't have to worry about, you know, exactly the words that you're humming.
Excellent. Okay, well, let's shift it a little bit to something a little more specific. There's several different kinds of talismans that can be made. You can certainly do a planetary one, and we've kind of focused on that. But there's also lunar mansions and, you know, and fixed star talismans. And again, we've been discussing this, our panel questions for several days. So let's bounce this out there. Let's say that you wanted to make like a Regulus talisman. What would be your focus or your focal things that you would be doing for a Regulus talisman? Just as an example, if you want to bounce to a different star, feel free. Joshua, why don't you kick us off with a conversation on Regulus or any other fixed star talisman you'd want to work on?
Sure. Well, I recently-ish sort of made some Regulus talismans, and it was my first bat. And I think, you know, I haven't, the first real successful talismans I made were fixed stars, Capella and Aldebaran, and I'd say those have been some of my favorite ones. And I think it's because, you know, I had more of an open, inspiring process to how I started it, because, and then the first thing was just trying to gain an understand of like mythically, what do these fixed stars mean? What are they meant to people across the world and across cultures? And what sort of qualities do these star spheres have? And by fully immersing myself into that, I was able to understand, it's like, okay, I'm really compelled by sort of like the nourishing threads of Capella. That is something that I feel that I am in need of, and also something that I respect deeply about, like the quality of the star. And so that gave me enough sort of dedication and motivation to approach that process. And And so that's really the beginning. And then, then I'm checking my traditional sources. So for fixed stars, I really like Quindecim Stellus, and Chris Warnock is the best because he has that on his website, Renaissance Astrology. And, I use that all the time. It's a bookmark. I printed it out. Understanding, looking at the traditional materials. It's like, use a sapphire. And I'm like, okay, well, I'm completely broke. I can't afford any sapphires whatsoever. So I used wax talismans. I used blue wax with horehound. And it was a whole process of me learning, well, how do I make like a wax base? Like, how do I source the materials? And I think that was also very, very deeply immersing. And it allowed me just to, really, really want it and really appreciate the fixed star. So there was this longing, I would say, for it, which was very, very essential. And then once I had it, being able to engrave it, oh gosh. And then the inscription that I know Chris has on his, like, cheerfulness is good medicine. Like, I live by that, like that 100%. Like the joy is so, so important. And so there's just like all these things popping up as I was learning more about the star. Like there were signs that was telling me this is going to be a good thing. And it really crescendos and like this, I think I had like 2.5 minutes to sort of make my engraving. I've never engraved wax before, and I mess up the first like disc, and then I use the second one, and I sort of made like a pouch. So I have the disc and some herbs, and then I sealed it up and fumigated the image and sealed it. And just like, boom, just like feeling it all, making sure, just really following the same process that I talked about before, and that everyone sort of has that framework. And then I wasn't sick for 2 years after making it, and just like always feeling very, very secure with this talisman of Capella, the fixed star, and having like a really deep, I would say, meditational and spiritual connection and contact with it, like during the area of the election and sort of after. And it's probably one of my most favorite talismanic experiences. But, I would highly emphasize, especially when, like, read your sources, traditional sources, but also feel inspired and feel compelled to make the talisman that you're doing. It definitely shouldn't be like, oh, I'm so afraid of my life, I need this talisman to fix it. Certainly, talismans can have fixing effects, but, I believe, you're making spirit relationships. And how do you want that relationship to be like? And if you're having problems understanding that, well, for me, I looked at, well, what are my relationships with people in my own life, and how do I want those to be? So you get to start on a clean foot with talismanic spirits that you make. So why not have that be, you get to choose what that is.
Yeah, I like that relationship idea. It is a relationship. Clifford, what about you? And like, say, like the difference between planetary talismans versus fixed star talismans, and especially like a fixed star talisman that maybe you've already made or one that you want to make, and talking about the difference maybe that you would approach from planet to star.
Sure. I'm madly in love with the Quindecim Stellus. I see the process of making all 15 of these talismans as an initiatic process, paralleling the Corpus Hermeticum into the 8th sphere. And I haven't quite made all 15. I still have to make Capella. That's one I haven't made, but recently I came into a great source for cheap sapphires, so that's next on the list. They are great and they're powerful, but they tend to be slow acting. Planets have this power described in Picatrix of great animation and speed of manifestation, especially if they are fast planets, the moon, Mercury, all the way up to the sun. The ones that are higher than that tend to be a little bit slower in their effects, but more durable in their effects overall. Fixed stars are also very narrower in their focus. The planets have dominion over a little bit more than 1/7 of reality. The fixed stars, the Bohemian fixed stars, have dominion over very specific phenomena. So Aldebaran is fame and fortune, and that's all it does. So if you have a particular need for fame and fortune, you might go with a planetary talisman because that's fast acting, but your planetary talisman may not necessarily do exactly what you expect it to do. So I've made a lot of Jupiter talismans for friends who expected to get wildly rich, and instead they became very devout, because Jupiter is the planet of religion as well as the planet of abundant wealth. But a fixed star talisman basically will do what it's programmed to do. It has a narrower job, and they're a little bit harder to create because I think that there's a lot more flexibility with the materials that you have with regards to planets than fixed stars. I've made wax fixed star talismans just like Josh. I made a a green wax spica talisman many, many years ago, but I feel as though it didn't have the same energetic influence that an emerald might have. And since then, of course, I've found a great, hello kitty cat, a great source for flawed emeralds, which are affordable. You don't need to have jewelry quality materials in order to draw upon the natural virtue and quintessence of the planets and fixed stars. You don't need to do that at all. The material has a kind of energetic resonance which will perform as you wish. There's a parallel tradition of magical rings in Vedic astrology, which are used curatively. Those require a clarity of the gemstone. This is not the case in the Western tradition of astrological magic at all. I've even made algal talismans with diamond dust under the ring with the sigil of algal on the top of it, and those worked maybe a little bit too powerfully.
What about you, Michael? Do you have a different idea with planet versus fixed star procedures, materials? And somebody remarked about the cool canister idea. That's awesome. I like that.
Thank you. Well, I have a cool canister for fixed stars also, which I put all the ingredients that connected with the star and set the stone, etc. I think that just to add something that maybe is not very common because of the little conversation we had before, then I'll talk a little bit about the election. The most specific election for fixed stars, or the most average ones, of course, the conjunction with the moon, either on the ascendant or the MC. There's some debate if the moon can be on the ascendant or not. I'm not going to get into that. But of course, we want to see the moon not separating from a malefic, or at least not from a badly placed malefic, with a square, conjunction, or opposition. And of course, if he's applying separately or applying from a benefic in a good aspect, in a good position, that's very good. And you can add extra elements from other electional rules of talisman. The thing that I'm experimenting with for a while, for a couple of years, which is not very common, is parantelons, which is the real time that the fixed star is rising, not it's projecting to the ecliptic or the zodiac, but the real time that he's conjunct the ascendant or the MC, and its relationship with other planets that co-rise with it or rise and culminate. One of the best, the most powerful fixed star talisman I made was for Regulus, conjuncting the sun, and not in its zodiacal degree, but on the Paran, while they're both co-rising. And it's interesting because I'll take a minute there. In the treatment of the fixed stars by Ptolemy speaks about the conjunction to the sun as the true phase. And phase in Greek means appearance. Now, this is interesting and kind of enigmatic because that's the most disappearance of the planet that could be, because it's conjunct the sun. And of course, Regulus is on the ecliptic, so we have no problem there. It's a real lineup. It's a real conjunction, ecliptic-wise. So there's no, debate on this. So this is very good for that. But and of course, it has solar qualities, so that also increases that. But it's interesting because he says that's the true phase of the planet, of the star, and in a sense, it's kind of connects to that more esoteric philosophical doctrine, speaking about the sun as the eye of Nous, right? So when something is it's like a Kazimi in a sense, it's in the eye, then you can see its true form in a sense. So it's in a sense, it's kind of projected with the sun, and its power is reinforced, and the whole light spreads with the solar light in a sense. Okay.
Okay.
I'm not describing that really good, but parans are something to check, and also heliacal rising of fixed stars. The heliacal rising of Sirius is a talisman we made many times, and it's very, very powerful. And other phases, which I will not get into here, but yeah, that's my 2 cents on this question.
We talked the other day about a star on the
Hey, what
ascendant.
about me?
Yes, the star on the
You're
ascendant.
skipping me. I get to talk about Regulus too, don't I?
Oh, okay. Yes, please go ahead. Go ahead.
Sorry. I was going to say, I'm going to try and see if I can get my camera on. Okay.
You've got it.
Regulus Talisman. Here it is.
Oh,
Woo-hoo,
nice.
I just got these. Beautiful. So again, I want to really emphasize the fact that it's funny how it's like, and this is not true of the present company, that somehow I know what the best method is, and it's mine. Gee, I've got the best method and I have the best thing to do. So what I find is that there's a lot of different ways to do this. And this traditional sources, if you look at Ficino, if you look at Agrippa, what they're talking about is having the fixed star in ecliptic longitude and doing, rising, typically it's rising, culminating, and then the conjunction, sextile or trine. So again, that's the framework the traditional sources say, but there's a lot of different ways to do it. And it makes sense to me, all the different types of aspects, the parans, the also heliacal rising is a very traditional too. So again, these are all ways that can be done. What you need to do is figure out what really resonates for you and what's the best for you. And you never want to be going and saying somebody else's methodology is not going to work, even if it doesn't work for you, because you can't walk in their shoes. So so I think that Regulus is interesting because what I like of Regulus is it's a really great talisman for somebody who's got an afflicted sun, because it's got this solar quality to it. It's got that sort of uplifting, it's got the energy, it's got the mood lifting, and it also makes you temperate. And I think so it's a really nice kind of the thing about fixed stars is that they're great, or mansions of the other celestial factors. They're great if you have afflicted planets. Maybe you don't want to mess around with them. Maybe you're not quite ready to engage with that energy. Eventually, maybe you want to do that. But you say, hey, if it's afflicted, I'm going to try and use something alternative. Like, for example, afflicted Venus, you might want to use a mansion talisman, some of the mansion love talismans. So I think Regulus is great on its own. Again, a very solar effect. It's the heart of the lion. And it's really a talisman that I have enjoyed working with and I'm glad to have available. It's one I try to keep constantly available on my website. But for me, the fixed star, I do a similar ritual. I don't have a differentiation between a planetary and a fixed star ritual. Most of the factors are fairly similar in terms of the framework I use. Invocations are going to be different, obviously, depending on the source. We don't have quite the amount of fixed star invocations that we do. Like Picatrix only has one, and that's for Alkide, I think, and it's a pretty malefic invocation. So unlike a lot of things, we don't have invocations for those. So I have a number of ones that I've written myself, or Nigel Jackson, who's an artist I work with, wrote, and that's kind of a fun way to be creative and write your own stuff. So fixed stars, one of the great things about fixed stars, though, is for protection. And that's in our sources. We don't have planetary talismans that are good for, listed as being good for spiritual protection, whereas we have a lot of them, fixed stars. Procyon, it's funny how Cliff and I have different pronunciations. I guess I'm in Iowa. So it's Procyon, and then Antares, Alkide, Algol. These are all really good protection talismans. And I actually have a different, for me, Cliff was saying that fixed stars, at least for him, only have limited use. I actually find a similar thing, that they do have the broad, unpredictable effects that you have with planetary talismans, again, within their rulership, whatever the areas they do, it's kind of unpredictable. So again, I think fixed stars, it's nice that people are getting to the point where they're willing to go beyond planets. So they're now, I think a lot of people doing astrological magic are saying, hey, fixed stars, I'm excited about that. I notice all the panelists have really had a lot of experience with them, got a lot of under their belt. It's great to see that. I had a guy email me about decans, and I said, you know what? Those are so exotic that people have never heard of them, and there's not much demand for decan or face talismans. So eventually, hopefully 10 years from now, we'll have people saying, oh, where's your decan and face talismans? I love them. So I think that's one of the great things about fixed stars, is that people are waking up and saying, hey, there's more than just planets, that we can go off and do this, and we have a really full toolkit. Because if you think of all the different possible things that you can make with talismans, there's hundreds of different kinds of talismans. So that's really one of the most exciting things about it. So I think that fixed stars are great. They have amazing uses, and it's really exciting to see all the different ways that, you know, the panelists, for example, and I'm sure the rest of the community have been making fixed star talismans.
Well, we just discussed the other day about when you have a star on the rising, on the horizon, with whether with Michael's technique with the sun or with the moon versus having the fixed star on the midheaven with the sun, that the rising is like it's awakening form of the star. It's awakening energies, whereas the midheaven is the culmination of that star's powers, which I thought that was a fascinating kind of conceptual, wow, I hadn't approached it that way, but I think that's fascinating. And you can certainly do it with the parents at the culmination of the star when it culminates with the sun rising. I mean, I'm sure you could juggle it around a bit. So that's really fascinating. Okay, so we're in the last mile here. And my last question is a bit of a ringer. What do you do to add power and magical strength to your talisman making rituals? And if you don't want to address that, I want to ask you, do you think talismans and planetary rituals have the ability to change your fate? So are you putting strength into it, or would you rather answer the question about the fate? Those are our last two questions. Any takers? Chris, Cliff?
Yeah, let me jump in here on that one. Okay, so I thought that was a really interesting question. I mean, if you ever seen a movie, a 20th century movie, it's funny because they can always change your fate. And then the end of the movie is, you can do whatever you want. Very modern approach. And there's something about even like modern astrology. I was once teaching a little traditional module, and I asked them about fate, and they said, oh, no, there's no fate. I said, well, what about the fact that, for example, in my natal chart, I've got Mars opposite to my Mercury. You know, it tends to make me really, I can be very aggressive in talking. I'm good at debate. I said, but I'll never be a wallflower. I mean, I can do it positively and be good at debate, negatively and be angry. Like I said, I'll never be a wallflower. Isn't that fate? And they got really upset. They actually reported me to the president of the school. And it's just, fate is a dirty word to modern people. And it's really not something that modern astrologers, they run from. Traditionally, I mean, as astrologers, you know, we're the votaries of fate. I mean, that's what we see unfolding all the time. Now, I think that the traditional view was that fate and free will operate at the same time. And that's certainly, when I do horary astrology, for example, that's what I look at. It's like some situations, like if someone says, am I going to walk across the street? Well, you have a lot of control over that. If someone says, will I be elected president of the United States? No, it's not happening. You don't have control over that. So a lot of it is, in each situation, there's going to be a certain amount of flex. But ultimately, this view of fate is from a view of, as a Buddhist, of the self. And that's what the Buddha says. You know, the self is attachment. The self is wanting things to be other than what they are. And that's where our suffering comes from. And there's a traditional view of providence, which is everything fits together. There's a patterning that's positive. And so if we have a little higher view of reality, if we have a less self-oriented view of reality, we might not have such a negative view. But it really comes down to what your view of fate is. So that's what you have to think about with that question. And everyone's going to have a different answer to that question. My tendency would be to say, you know, that it's like the acorn who doesn't want to be an oak. You know, what good is that, right? I mean, your fate is who you are. And so if you're changing who you really are, I don't even know if that's possible or even desirable. But certainly I think with talismans, you can nudge things a little bit. You know, they talk about when you do blackjack, it's it's 1%, right? 1%, and the house can win all their money from you. If you count cards, you got a 1% advantage, and you can win all your money back from them. They'll throw you out. So that's pretty good. If I have a talisman that gives me a 1% advantage, people would say, oh, that's useless. But I'm like, in fact, that can make a big difference depending on how you use it. So that's what I would say about it. Is I think the big picture, why would you want to change your fate? On a small level, hey, if you're saying I want to bump my receipts up for my business a little bit, you know, or I want to see, you know, an increase in sales or something, yeah, you probably can do that with talismans. And you can you can certainly have a strong effect. They do work. As far as how reaching that is, I think it really depends on the individual and then what your view are. But I wouldn't want to say, oh, you know, yes or no, absolutely on that. I think the key thing with that would be to looking into what do you think fate is, and then that would pretty much reveal what, you know, the ability of the talisman to change that, you know, in terms of your own view.
Okay, very good. Before I ask my next panelist about this question about fate, and I think it's a fascinating one, we are getting towards the end of the panel. If you would like to type into the chat box things that you would like to see in future Q&A panels, questions you would like to ask. We're not going to get to everybody's chat questions this time, but if you have topics you'd like to have panelists speak about, please do put those in the chat box, and I'll try and copy them down, and we'll try to arrange future panels to address these issues in the future. So let me bounce to you, Michael. How are you feeling about the fate issue? Do talismans change fate? Do you have that same kind of question that Christopher has about how do you view fate as having something to do with that?
Yes, of course. Well, I have many different ways to answer this. I would just say something. If someone has a kidney transplant, has he changed his fate? Or if he had his tooth fixed, the fate of the tooth has changed, right? You know, we are doing many things to mitigate the pains in our lives, and we have a lot of options. And this is something that I would say maybe the Greeks would talk about the difference between being ignorant or knowledgeable of something. And if you're knowledgeable, then you have more options. So I don't even think that's the aim of the game. It's not the aim of the game for me. You know, I sympathize with what Chris has said, that in a sense, fate is who you are, and in a sense, who you want to be. It's just a sense of the options to express, in a sense, maybe a higher form of fate, or mitigate and strengthen what's possible. I think fate is a kind of forked garden, you know, like Borges' story, you know. You can choose from a spectrum of possibilities, you know, converging on the same basic structure. You don't need to suffer some things if you have knowledge of how to mitigate them. And I also think that sometimes the planetary talismans, you know, when they introduce something that in a sense was not fated for you, but you gain from the talisman, then it also triggers your natal potential there. And it can also trigger some, you know, accelerate things that have to do with the inner processes that have to do with that. And that may, in my view, also accelerate certain healing and confrontation with those places. I don't think you could really skip the basic structure of your fate, but you can truly accelerate certain healing of natal issues, and from this, I think, you know, is the growth in all this. You know, for me, astral magic is the art of aligning with the cosmos, and when you align with the cosmos, it's in a sense above your individual needs. They are there and they're important, but it's serving your part in the creative process. It's becoming more than who you are. It's becoming a cosmos in a sense. So that's a spiritual path. That's much more than tricking the fate. It's bringing harmony. It's bringing health. It's bringing healing to other people. It's really the alchemical stages. You know, it's the Hermetic, Neoplatonic, whatever, you know, they're all speaking about the virtues and how you, in a sense, rise above certain crude expressions of those virtues. It doesn't have to be so crude and raw and polarized. You can make it a higher form, like in alchemy. You can make it more distilled and noble. And this is where you grow soul-wise and have more options to mitigate certain polarized and raw elements of your faith. So this is, in a sense, how I would put it for now. But it's a really interesting question. We should elaborate on it sometime.
Yes. So Clifford, I know you've talked about in the past, remediating and the remediating effects of talismans. Is remediating the same thing as changing your fate?
Absolutely. I wanted to say that one of the objectives of Iamblican theurgy is to escape fate. It's to be liberated from fate. That's what he believed the whole process of magic was, this initiatory process where your daimon would elevate itself, or you would go up the chain of hierarchy so you would not be bound by fate anymore. And there's some evidence that this is possible from canonical sources. There's a account of a prince who wore each of the planetary rings according to the planetary day and lived to be the maximum human lifespan, which I think varies on account, maybe 140 years. And if that isn't changing the fate, radical life extension, I don't know what is. So that's an extreme form of remediation.
Right, but remediation is changing fate.
Yes,
Yes.
absolutely.
Yes. Now, does the Buddhist Taoist version have a different view of that, Joshua? Is it changed within your practice?
Well, thank you for I'm not going to speak for all Buddhists at the moment, or all Buddhist philosophy, but thank you for phrasing it that way. I appreciate your confidence in my answer. Then in Buddhism, like there's a Tibetan term like tendrel, which is like dependent arising or interdependent circumstances. Within that, the Vajrayana cosmology, I think that starts the foundation of magic, but also karma, and also I think loops into what is it? There's like, what is the philosophy of causes? Like pretty sure, I forget if it's Aristotle or whatever that is. I'm not going to speak on that because I obviously don't know. But from a Buddhist point, I would say that, the question doesn't really get to the heart of the issue, because I think, by acting differently, am I able to change what was going to happen if I acted a different way? Well, yes, you can choose to act differently by making a talisman. And for me, how I like to understand my practice of planetary magic as, deepening relationships with the planets. I think about, I've started a number of businesses and nonprofits in my life. Some have failed, some haven't. Why did some succeed while the others didn't? It's because I had better relationships with the people in order to make things successful. By making these talismans or engaging in magic, I am building relationships with the planetary hierarchies that I would not have if I just decided to see myself as an independent actor, incapable of introducing myself to them in this sort of way. So if you have an understanding that, these things are possible, then, ultimately, am I really carving out fate? I don't know if I believe this, but if there's like some, malefic demiurge sort of deterministically saying this is how things will be and it better not change, and if the magician can carve that out, that's kind of terrifying to think that ultimately you are changing something that someone put into place. What are the repercussions of that? Should we even be doing this magic? If that is the case, I'm sure if there is an afterlife, I'm sure someone's going to visit us afterwards and be like, hey, you're the one of these people that did this. So that's really interesting. I don't know if I really fully believe that, but I think it's a terrifying and very exciting proposition. But ultimately, 100% we're able to change like the probability of what's going to be happening by doing this magic. And at the point I said earlier, that is a frame of reality that seems to work fairly consistently. And that's one that I can get behind and continue to practice.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, we have perfect timing here. I would like to thank our 4 panelists. You guys are awesome. If you would please just turn off your videos. Don't leave the meeting so I can close out the recording for you. And I would thank everybody for showing up. And if you want to connect and, be on the SMARRT emailing list, just please connect with that same email. And we hopefully will set up another panel within the next few months. And I'm seeing some topics here, so I'm writing them down. And thank you so much, folks. I really appreciate it. Yes, Clifford.
My website is not cliffordlow.com, it's clifflow.com. I forgot to correct that earlier.
Sorry, I didn't.
All right.
I couldn't spit it out.
Mercury retrograde.
Mercury retrograde, yeah. And I think the moon is opposite Uranus today. And I was like, oh, you know, what a day to do to panel. But it turned out perfect. Thank you, Christopher. I'm sorry you got bounced off. You know, you're back again. Thank you. Thank you, Michael. And thank you, Joshua. That was really great. I loved it. I loved it. Thank you so much. We're getting lots of thanks from all of the attendees. And this is wonderful. We'll really try to do this again. Yes. Om Shanti to all of you. Thank you so much.
Panelists, stay on and don't close off because Elizabeth needs to unco-host you.